She was not born to rule, she was chosen to serve. Her status was not that of an empress, but of a gilded slave on the emperor's dragon bed, one of hundreds of nameless faces, a shadow that existed for a single purpose, to produce an heir. And in response, she gave that dying empire 50 more years of existence. From the gilded cage of the Forbidden City, this nameless woman clawed her way to absolute power. For half a century, as the men of the dynasty crumbled into decay and incompetence around her, she single-handedly held the rotting Qing Empire together, delaying its inevitable collapse through sheer political genius and an iron will. This is the story of Empress Dowager Cixi, the story of how the woman given the most powerless role in the empire seized the most absolute power, and how the gilded slave became the lonely final warden of her own prison. To understand the improbable rise of Cixi, one must look at the world that created her, a mid-19th century Chinese empire that appeared powerful but was, in reality, on the brink of collapse. The Qing Dynasty, once at its zenith, was now rotten from within due to corruption and uprisings, while being simultaneously humiliated by Western powers. The First Opium War was a disaster, exposing the court's weakness and forcing China to accept the first of its unequal treaties. At the same time, a horrific civil war, the Taiping Rebellion, erupted, devastating the country and claiming the lives of tens of millions of people. It was against this chaotic backdrop that a young Manchu girl named Yehe Nara Xingzhen was chosen to enter the Forbidden City. This was a world unto itself, a gilded cage of splendor, but filled with suffocating rules. Here, thousands of women competed fiercely in silence for a single purpose: to win the emperor's favor and produce an heir. Most would fade into obscurity, but this girl, whom history would come to know as Cixi, didn't just come to play the game of power. She came to rewrite the rules. She was born on November 29, 1835, into a respectable but ultimately unremarkable Manchu family belonging to the Bordered Blue Banner, one of the 8 military administrative divisions into which all Manchus were organized. Her clan, the Yehe Nara, was an ancient and noble one, famous in Manchu lore for having once been a formidable rival to the Isinjoro clan, the future imperial family. Legend even held that a Yehe Nara chief, on his deathbed, had sworn a curse that a woman of his clan would one day avenge them and bring down the Isinjoro dynasty. It was a piece of historical folklore that would later be resurrected to add a layer of dark prophecy to Cixi's story. Her father, Huizheng, was a mid-level civil servant who held a series of provincial posts. While the family enjoyed the privileges of their Manchu aristocratic status, they were far from the center of power and wealth in Beijing. For a girl of her standing, the path in life was seemingly preordained. Receive a proper, if limited, education in the womanly arts, learn the complex web of courtly etiquette, and hope for a strategic marriage that could elevate her family's status. But even from a young age, it was clear that the young Yehe Nara was different. While most girls of her class were taught embroidery, painting, and music, Cixi received a surprisingly robust academic education, likely at the insistence of her father. She learned to read and write fluently in both the Manchu and Chinese languages, a level of literacy that was highly unusual for a woman of her time and would later become one of her greatest political assets. She was endowed with a sharp, observant mind and a memory that was said to be photographic. She absorbed the great classical texts, historical records, and poetry that formed the basis of a traditional Chinese education. She was not just being prepared for marriage, she was being prepared, however unwittingly, for power. Her early life was also marked by the sting of hardship. Her father died in 1853 while holding a post in Anhui province, leaving the family in a precarious financial position. This early taste of vulnerability, of how quickly fortune and status could evaporate, instilled in her a deep-seated understanding of the precariousness of life and a ruthless instinct for self-preservation. It was a lesson in vigilance and self-reliance that she would carry with her into the treacherous world of the imperial court. In 1852, her great chance arrived. The Daoguang emperor had died, and his frail, melancholic son had ascended the throne as the Shenfeng emperor. As was customary, a nationwide selection, or Quanshu, was held to populate the new emperor's harem with young, eligible women from prominent Manchu families. Cixi, then 16 years old, was one of 60 young women selected for the final inspection before the emperor and the Empress Dowager. The scene would have been one of incredible tension and artifice. The young women, dressed in their finest traditional Manchu robes, would have stood in silent rows in one of the Forbidden City's courtyards, their futures hanging on a single glance from the Son of Heaven. Cixi was not considered the most beautiful among them. Contemporary accounts describe her as having fine features and beautiful hands, but it was an intensity in her eyes, a spark of formidable intelligence and unshakable self-possession that set her apart. She was chosen. Upon entering the Forbidden City, she was given the court name Lan Girin, meaning Noble Lady Orchid, and assigned the lowly rank of a sixth-tier consort. She was at this point just one of hundreds of women vying for the attention of a single man, a man who held the fate of the empire in his hands. In this nest of vipers, where jealousy was a weapon and obscurity was a death sentence, most women simply disappeared, swallowed by the immense impersonal machinery of the court. But Noble Lady Orchid had no intention of disappearing. She had a plan. The Shanfeng Emperor was a troubled and tragic figure. He inherited a dynasty in crisis, and he was temperamentally ill-equipped to handle it. Overwhelmed by the raging Taiping rebellion in the south and the ever-present, ever-encroaching threat of the Western powers on the coast, he was a man plagued by ill health, anxiety, and indecision. He often sought escape in wine, women, and the theater, shirking the heavy burdens of statecraft. While other concubines competed to be the most beautiful flower in the imperial garden, Cixi chose to be the only tree. She understood that while the emperor's passion was a fleeting resource, his burden of rule was infinite. She therefore made herself not an object of his desire, but an indispensable tool of his power. She learned his habits, his passions, his deepest worries and fears. She understood that he was not just a symbol of power, but a burdened and lonely man. Her literacy became her key. As the emperor's health deteriorated and his eyesight failed, he found it increasingly difficult to read the mountain of official documents, memorials, and edicts that flooded his desk each day. Cixi, the educated noble Lady Orchid, made herself useful. She began to help him read and sort through these documents, offering her clear voice and sharp intellect to the beleaguered monarch. She did not just read the words, she understood their meaning, their implications. She began to discuss matters of state with him, offering her own shrewd insights. She became not just a companion for his bed, but a confidant for his mind, an informal and indispensable political secretary. The emperor, weary of his sycophantic and often useless ministers, grew increasingly reliant on her sharp mind and decisive opinions. In a court where women were meant to be decorative and silent, Cixi made herself essential through her intellect. Her status in the palace began to rise accordingly. From a sixth-rank concubine, she was promoted to the fifth, then the fourth. She was becoming a person of consequence. But she knew, with cold clarity, that this favor was precarious. It depended entirely on the whim of the emperor. True security, permanent power, could only come one way. She needed to give the emperor what no other woman in the palace had yet managed to provide: a son. The Empress, Neohuru, was a kind and dignified woman, but she remained childless. Other concubines had also failed to produce an heir. The succession of the entire Qing Dynasty rested on this single biological imperative. In 1855, Cixi became pregnant. The hopes and anxieties of the entire court now focused on her. The pregnancy was her moment of maximum leverage and maximum vulnerability. On the 27th of April, 1856, in the idyllic surroundings of the old summer palace, she delivered a healthy baby boy. It was the emperor's first and only surviving male heir, Zaishun. This single event was her golden ticket. It transformed her life and the destiny of China forever. The emperor was overjoyed. Cixi was immediately elevated to the rank of Yi Guifei, or noble consort Yi. This promotion catapulted her to the second highest rank in the imperial harem. She was now the second most powerful woman in the empire, surpassed only by the childless Empress, who would later be given the title Qian. Cixi was no longer just another concubine. She was the mother of the future, the biological source of the Qing Dynasty's continuation. Her position was, for the moment, unassailable, but as her star rose to its zenith within the protected walls of the palace, the world outside was collapsing into flames. The temporary peace with the West was about to shatter, and a new, more terrible humiliation was descending upon Beijing, one that would break the emperor, set the stage for a deadly power struggle, and present Cixi with the single greatest crisis and opportunity of her life. Her victory within the palace walls was absolute, but the battle for China itself was about to begin. As Cixi consolidated her unassailable position as the mother of the heir within the serene, perfumed confines of the old summer palace, the storm that had been gathering on China's horizon was about to break with the force of a typhoon. The Treaty of Nanjing had not settled the conflict between China and the West. It had merely been a ceasefire. The British, French, and Americans, driven by a desire for even greater trade concessions, diplomatic representation in Beijing, and the full legalization of the opium trade, were seeking any pretext to force the Qing Dynasty's hand once more. They did not have to wait long. In October 1856, a Chinese-owned but Hong Kong-registered ship named the Arrow, which was widely suspected of piracy and smuggling, was boarded by Qing officials in Canton, who arrested its crew. The British consul, Harry Parkes, a man known for his aggressive and confrontational style, claimed the officials had insulted the British flag, despite evidence the flag was not even flying at the time. The incident was trivial, a minor squabble in a busy port, but it was the spark the British needed. At the same time, the French found their own cause for war in the execution of a French missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been illegally proselytizing in the interior of Guangxi province. United by their shared imperial ambitions, Britain and France formed an alliance to bring China to heel. The Second Opium War began, like the first, with a series of decisive and humiliating defeats for the Qing. An Anglo-French force bombarded and captured the city of Canton, taking the provincial governor-general captive. When the Shanfeng Emperor's court in Beijing dithered and refused to negotiate, the Allies sailed north in 1858, capturing the crucial Taku forts that guarded the approach to Tianjin, the gateway to the capital. Shaken, the emperor agreed to the Treaty of Tientsin, a document even more punitive than the Treaty of Nanjing. It granted foreigners the right to establish embassies in Beijing, open new ports to trade, allowed for unrestricted Christian missionary activity, and legalized the importation of opium. Yet in a final act of defiance born of pride and desperation, the court resisted the treaty's ratification. When the foreign envoys returned in 1859 to exchange the signed documents, they found the river route to Tianjin blocked and the Taku forts refortified. In a rare and stunning victory, the Qing forces, under the command of the brilliant Mongol general Senge Rinchen, repelled the British and French assault, sinking 4 gunboats and inflicting heavy casualties. The court in Beijing was jubilant. It was a moment of false hope, a brief flicker of defiance that would provoke a terrible and overwhelming retribution. Enraged by the humiliation at Taku, Britain and France assembled a much larger and more powerful expeditionary force. In the summer of 1860, they returned. They easily overwhelmed the Taku forts and marched inland toward Beijing. General Senge Rinchen, confident in his elite Mongol cavalry, the pride of the Manchu dynasty, made his final stand at Palikao Bridge, just a few miles from the capital. The battle that followed was a slaughter. The Mongol horsemen, armed with lances, bows, and swords, charged with immense bravery directly into the disciplined, rapid-firing volleys of the Allied infantry's modern rifles and the devastating shrapnel of their Armstrong cannons. The battle was not a contest of courage, but a collision of 2 different realities. The bravery of the Mongol cavalry was a magnificent, useless poem recited in the face of the cold, hard prose of the Armstrong cannon. In a single morning, an ancient theory of warfare was proven tragically, suicidally wrong. Panic gripped the Forbidden City. The news of the disaster at Palikao shattered the last vestiges of imperial resistance. As the foreign barbarians advanced on his capital, the Xianfeng emperor's nerve broke completely. His ministers frantically debated what to do: flee or stay, fight or negotiate. Ultimately, the decision was made. On the pretext of an annual autumn hunting tour, the emperor, along with Cixi, the empress, the young heir Zaichun, and a vast retinue of court officials and eunuchs, fled the capital in a state of chaos and terror. They headed north to the imperial mountain resort of Chengde, a place of safety hundreds of miles beyond the Great Wall. The Son of Heaven was abandoning his celestial capital. Prince Gong, the emperor's younger and far more capable brother, was left behind with the impossible and dangerous task of negotiating with the vengeful invading armies. As the imperial court fled in disgrace, the Allied forces arrived at the gates of Beijing. What happened next would be seared into China's collective memory as an act of unparalleled barbarism, a wound that has not fully healed to this day. The soldiers marched to the northwest of the city where they discovered the Yuanming Yuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness, known more commonly as the Old Summer Palace. The Yuanming Yuan was not a single palace, but a vast, sprawling wonderland of art and architecture, the dynasty's most cherished retreat. Spanning over 800 acres, it was an earthly paradise of man-made hills, shimmering lakes, and winding streams, dotted with hundreds of exquisite halls, pagodas, temples, and libraries. It was the culmination of 150 years of Qing artistic achievement, a treasure house filled with an unimaginable collection of priceless antiques, jade carvings, silk tapestries, porcelain vases, gold and silver artifacts, and ancient books and scrolls. It even contained a special section of European-style palaces and fountains designed by Jesuit missionaries, a testament to an earlier, more curious engagement with the West. The Yuanming Yuan was, quite simply, one of the artistic wonders of the world, the jewel in the imperial crown. For the Allied soldiers, stumbling upon this treasure trove was like a dream. Discipline evaporated. A frenzy of looting began. Officers and soldiers alike ran rampant through the pavilions, smashing what they could not carry, using their rifle butts to shatter priceless porcelain, tearing down ancient calligraphy from the walls, and competing with each other to seize the most valuable treasures. For days, the palace was systematically plundered. Wagon loads of loot were carted away. An auction was even held among the officers for the most valuable items. But the final act of destruction was yet to come. During the chaotic negotiations, a delegation of British and French envoys, led by Harry Parkes, had been arrested and imprisoned by Qing officials. Many of them were tortured, and nearly half died in captivity. When the survivors were released, their emaciated and brutalized state horrified their countrymen. The British High Commissioner Lord Elgin sought a terrible revenge. He wanted to inflict a punishment so severe that it would personally wound the emperor and shatter the dynasty's prestige forever. He decided not to destroy the Forbidden City, as that would harm the common people, but to burn the Yuanmingyuan, the emperor's personal playground, to the ground. For 3 days the Garden of Perfect Brightness burned. A force of thousands of men went from building to building, setting them alight with torches. A vast column of black smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles, a funeral pyre for a dynasty's pride. The destruction was absolute. By the time the fires died down, the most magnificent palace complex in China had been reduced to a smoldering ruin, a wasteland of charred timbers and fractured marble. The act was meant to terrorize and humiliate, and it succeeded beyond measure. It became a permanent symbol of foreign aggression and a scar of national shame that fueled Chinese nationalism for the next century. News of the destruction of his beloved palace reached the emperor at the Qingde mountain villa. The psychological blow was final and absolute. Already a frail and melancholic man, the humiliation broke him completely. He plunged into a deep depression, refusing all entreaties to return to the capital, even after Prince Gong had successfully negotiated the Convention of Beijing, finally ending the war on terms utterly devastating to China. While his brother grappled with the grim reality of managing a defeated nation, the Xianfeng emperor retreated into a world of alcohol, opium, and theatrical performances, his health rapidly deteriorating. The court at Qingde became a hothouse of fear, paranoia, and intense political maneuvering. Everyone could see that the emperor was dying and a vicious power struggle was brewing around his deathbed. On one side were the two most senior women of the court, the official empress, Niuhuru, who was respected for her virtue but was politically passive, and Cixi, who was recognized for her intelligence and, crucially, was the mother of the 5-year-old heir apparent, Zai Chun. On the other side was a powerful clique of arch-conservative Manchu nobles who had accompanied the emperor to Qingde. They despised the foreign barbarians and deeply resented Prince Gong for having negotiated with them. Their leaders were the imperial princes Zai Yuan and Duanhua, and most formidably Su Shun, a clever, arrogant, and ruthless official who had become the emperor's closest advisor. They saw Cixi as a dangerously ambitious upstart, a mere concubine who had bewitched the emperor with her charms and was now meddling in affairs of state that were not her concern. They were determined to seize control of the government upon the emperor's death and push both the empresses and Prince Gong aside. In August 1861, as the emperor lay dying, he was persuaded by Su Shun's faction to sign a final edict. It named his 5-year-old son as his successor to be known as the Tongji Emperor. To govern during the boy's minority, he appointed a council of 8 regents, comprised entirely of Su Shun and his allies. Prince Gong was deliberately excluded. It seemed as though Su Shun had won. However, in a move that revealed his lingering affection and trust for Cixi, The dying emperor tried to create a check on the regent's power. He bestowed 2 imperial seals, symbols of ultimate authority. One, bearing the characters Qi was given to the Empress Qian. The other, with the characters Tongdaotong, was given to Cixi. The emperor's decree stipulated that any edict issued by the regents would only be valid if it was stamped with both seals. In theory, this gave the 2 women veto power. In reality, it was a formula for an immediate and violent confrontation. The regents held the young emperor and controlled the levers of government. The 2 women held only a pair of stone seals. On August 22, 1861, the Shanfeng emperor died at the age of 30. From that moment, a silent war began. Cixi, now officially the Empress Dowager Cixi, knew that she and the senior Empress Dowager Qian were in mortal danger. Sushun and the regents made no secret of their contempt for her. They began to govern unilaterally, ignoring the requirement of the seals and treating the 2 empresses as little more than decorative prisoners. Cixi knew that as soon as they returned to Beijing, the regents would consolidate their power, and she would be, at best, permanently sidelined in the depths of the Forbidden City, or at worst, eliminated altogether. She had to act, and she had to act fast. From the tense seclusion of the mountain resort, Cixi began to plot a counterstroke of breathtaking audacity. She knew she could not take on the powerful regents alone. She needed a powerful ally, one with influence, legitimacy, and military connections in the capital. Her choice was obvious: Prince Gong. While the court was in exile, she had maintained secret contact with the prince through loyal eunuchs who acted as her covert messengers. Prince Gong, for his part, harbored a deep resentment against Sushun's faction for shutting him out of power and leaving him to face the foreigners alone. He recognized the regents as incompetent ideologues who would lead the dynasty to ruin. A secret alliance was forged, an alliance of mutual interest and survival. The regent's plan was to stage a grand, slow funeral procession to transport the late emperor's coffin back to Beijing. This overland journey was dictated by tradition and would take weeks, giving them time to solidify their control along the way. Sushun himself would escort the coffin. Cixi saw her opportunity in this delay. She argued that the young Tongji emperor should not be exposed to the rigors of the long land journey and should return to the capital ahead of the main procession. The regents, perhaps underestimating her, or perhaps seeing no harm in separating the boy from the ceremonial power of his father's coffin, foolishly agreed. It was a brilliant strategic move. While Sushun and the funeral cortege moved at a snail's pace back to Beijing, Cixi, Qian, and the young emperor raced ahead, taking a faster route down the Grand Canal. This was the race for Beijing, a race for the throne itself. By reaching the capital first, they seized the political initiative. Prince Gong, having been alerted by Cixi's messengers, was ready. He had secured the loyalty of the commander of the Beijing garrison, and his political network in the capital was primed for action. On November 1, 1861, the 2 dowager empresses arrived in Beijing and were met by Prince Gong. They immediately ensconced themselves within the Forbidden City, securing the person of the child emperor. The trap was set. Just as Sushun's procession neared the capital, the storm broke. In what became known as the Xinyu coup, Cixi and Prince Gong moved with ruthless speed and precision. On November 2nd, Cixi convened a meeting with Prince Gong and key officials. Wielding the absolute maternal authority granted to her by Confucian tradition and with the power of the imperial seals, she issued a stream of edicts in the name of her son. The edicts accused the 8 regents of treason, of having forged the late emperor's will, and of gross incompetence in their handling of state affairs. They were stripped of all their titles and powers and ordered to be arrested. The regents were caught completely by surprise. Zhaiyuan and Duanhua, who had traveled with the young emperor, were arrested in Beijing without a fight. Sushun, still on the road with the imperial coffin, was ambushed and taken prisoner at a relay station in the middle of the night. He was reportedly dragged from his bed, screaming insults and vowing that he regretted not having Cixi killed earlier. The judgment was swift and brutal. Cixi and Prince Gong knew that to secure their victory, they had to be merciless. Sushun, as the ringleader, was condemned as a traitor. He was taken to the Kaishiku execution ground, the public marketplace, and beheaded like a common criminal. The public execution of such a high-ranking Manchu nobleman sent a shockwave through the aristocracy. It was a clear and bloody message. There was a new power in charge. The other two main conspirators, Zhaiyuan and Duanhua, were graciously permitted to commit suicide in their homes. The remaining regents were stripped of their ranks and banished. In a matter of days, Cixi had gone from a vulnerable widow in danger of assassination to the undisputed master of the Qing Dynasty. The Jinyu coup was a stunning success. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering, combining strategic timing, secret alliances, and the decisive use of both traditional authority and military force. At the age of just 26, Cixi had outwitted and destroyed the most powerful men in the empire. A new government was immediately formed, one that would define the political landscape of China for the next 2 decades. The regency of the 8 nobles was officially abolished. In its place, a new unprecedented structure was created. The 2 empresses, Dowager, Qian, and Cixi, would act as co-regents for the young Tongji emperor. To maintain propriety in the deeply patriarchal Confucian system, they would not show their faces in court. Instead, they would rule from behind a yellow silk screen placed behind the boy emperor's throne, a practice known as Cui Lian Teng Zheng, listening to politics from behind the curtain. Prince Gong, his loyalty and competence now rewarded, was appointed Prince Regent, head of the powerful Grand Council, and put in charge of the day-to-day administration of the government. The era of the 2 dowager empresses had begun. The young woman who had entered the Forbidden City less than a decade earlier, as a lowly 6th-rank concubine, now held the fate of 400 million people in her hands. She had survived the collapse of the world she knew, navigated a deadly power struggle, and emerged with absolute authority. But seizing power was one thing. Governing a shattered and broken empire was another entirely. With the Taiping Rebellion still consuming the South, the imperial treasury empty, and the shadow of the Western powers looming ever-present, Cixi and her new government faced a task that seemed all but impossible. The question now was not just whether she could rule, but whether she could save a dynasty that was already halfway to its grave. Having seized the throne through a brilliant conspiracy, she now faced the far greater challenge of governing a broken empire. With the blood of the Xinyu coup still fresh, and the vanquished regents either dead or disgraced, a new and unprecedented power structure settled over the Forbidden City. For the first time in the Qing Dynasty's history, the ultimate authority of the Dragon Throne rested not in the hands of a male emperor, but with 2 women. The era of the co-regency had begun, a period that would be defined by the complex partnership of its 3 principal architects, the 2 Empress Dowagers, Cixi and Qian, and the Prince Regent, Gong. At the apex of this triumvirate was Cixi. At 26, she was the junior of the 2 dowagers, but she was unquestionably the driving political force. The years of assisting the ailing Qianfeng emperor had been a masterclass in statecraft. She possessed a formidable intellect, a near photographic memory for detail, and an insatiable appetite for work. While the child emperor sat on the throne as a silent symbol, Cixi, hidden behind the yellow silk screen, was the true sovereign. Day after day she would listen as ministers presented their memorials, reports on everything, from military campaigns and tax revenues to provincial appointments and flood control. She was a keen judge of character, quickly learning to distinguish between capable officials and fawning sycophants. She was pragmatic, unsentimental, and driven by a singular overriding goal: the preservation of the Qing Dynasty and, by extension, her own power. Her partner in rule was the senior Empress Dowager, Qing. History, often colored by Cixi's detractors, has tended to portray Qing as a simple, naive figurehead, easily manipulated by the brilliant Cixi. The truth was more complex. Qing was indeed quiet, deeply virtuous, and largely uninterested in the day-to-day grind of politics. But she was universally respected for her integrity and her status as the late emperor's principal wife. She provided an indispensable air of legitimacy and moral authority to their unconventional rule, while Cixi handled the hard-edged realities of politics and war. Xian managed the labyrinthine affairs of the imperial household and acted as a moral compass for the court. Western observers, expecting a classic tale of harem intrigue, were surprised to find that for nearly 20 years, the two women ruled together in remarkable harmony. They formed a balanced and effective partnership. Xian's gentle, stabilizing presence softened Cixi's sharp edges and reassured conservative officials who were wary of a woman wielding such immense power. The public face of this new government and its indispensable chief executive was Prince Gong. As Prince Regent and head of the Grand Council, he was the most powerful man in the empire. Having been forced to negotiate with the foreigners, he possessed a far more realistic understanding of the outside world than the ideologues he had helped overthrow. He was intelligent, pragmatic, and the leading advocate for a policy of cautious engagement and modernization. He also headed the Zhongli Yamen, a revolutionary institution that was, for all intents and purposes, China's first formal foreign ministry. It signaled a tectonic shift away from the old worldview of China as the center of the universe, surrounded by deferential tributaries and a reluctant acceptance of a new world of coexisting and often competing nation-states. Together, this triumvirate, Cixi's political will, Qian's moral authority, and Prince Gong's administrative skill, would preside over the dynasty's last great period of revitalization, the Tongji Restoration. The term Tongji Restoration is, in many ways, a misnomer. It was not a period of radical innovation, but rather a desperate and deeply conservative attempt to restore and revitalize a dying dynasty. The goal was not to transform China, but to save it by strengthening its traditional Confucian foundations. The guiding philosophy of the era was the self-strengthening movement, encapsulated in the slogan, Chinese learning for the essential principles, Western learning for the practical applications. In essence, the reformers believed they could adopt the West's powerful military technology, its guns, ships, and railways, without disturbing the superior moral and political essence of Chinese civilization. It was an attempt to graft the branches of Western science onto the ancient trunk of Confucianism. The first and most urgent task facing the new leadership was to end the wave of catastrophic rebellions that were tearing the empire apart. Foremost among these was the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which for over a decade had controlled a vast swathe of southern China and had cost tens of millions of lives. In a move that demonstrated Cixi's signature pragmatism, The Manchu court set aside its deep-seated suspicion of the Han Chinese majority and threw its full support behind a new class of provincial Han scholar officials who had raised regional armies to defend the dynasty. The leader of this effort was Zheng Guofan, a stern, brilliant, and impeccably upright Confucian scholar. He had created the Shang army, a new type of military force that was organized around principles of loyalty, discipline, and Confucian ideology. Under Zheng and his brilliant protege, Li Hongzhang and Zhou Zongtang, the tide began to turn against the Taiping. The Qing court also made the pragmatic decision to cooperate with the Western powers, who, now satisfied with their treaty privileges, saw the Taiping rebels as a threat to their trade interests. A mercenary force of Chinese soldiers led by Western officers, the ever-victorious army, commanded first by the American Frederick Townsend Ward and later by the British officer Charles Chinese Gordon, helped to clear the area around Shanghai. The war was a brutal, grinding slog of sieges and scorched earth tactics. Zheng Guofan's strategy was slow but methodical, to encircle the Taiping capital of Nanjing, cutting off its supplies and strangling it into submission. Finally, in July 1864, after a 14-year reign of terror and war, Nanjing fell. The city was subjected to days of slaughter and looting. The Taiping leader, Hong Xiuquan, had already committed suicide by poison. The rebellion, which had shaken the dynasty to its core and bled the country white, was over. In the years that followed, the newly empowered regional armies under Li Hongzhang and Zhou Zongtang would go on to suppress the Nian rebellion in the north and the Muslim rebellions in the far west. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the empire was at peace. The success of these campaigns was a massive victory for the new regency, cementing its legitimacy and proving its effectiveness to a skeptical world. With the internal rebellions quelled, the Tongji Restoration turned its attention to the project of self-strengthening. Under the patronage of Prince Gong and powerful regional governors like Li Hongzhang and Zhuo Zongtang, a series of pioneering modernization projects were launched. Recognizing that they had been defeated by Western military technology, the first priority was to build a modern defense industry. Great arsenals, equipped with machinery imported from Europe and America, were established in Shanghai, Nanjing, and Tianjin to manufacture modern rifles, cannons, and ammunition. The Jiangnan Arsenal in Shanghai and the Fuzhou shipyard became massive industrial complexes, not only building warships and weapons, but also training a new generation of Chinese engineers and technicians. The Zhongli Yamen spearheaded diplomatic initiatives establishing the Tongwen, a college dedicated to teaching foreign languages and sciences to promising young students, a radical departure in a country whose education system had been focused exclusively on the Confucian classics for centuries. In an even more revolutionary step, the government sponsored the first educational missions abroad. In 1872, the first group of young Chinese boys, with their Manchu cues still intact, was sent to live with American families in New England and study in American schools and universities. The goal was to absorb the secrets of Western power at its source. At home, efforts were made to stabilize the economy, reform the hopelessly corrupt tax system, and invest in basic infrastructure. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as if the ancient dynasty, under the steady hand of its new leaders, was finally stirring from its slumber and taking its first tentative steps into the modern world. However, the restoration was fraught with fundamental contradictions that would ultimately seal its doom. The reforms were piecemeal and uncoordinated, often driven by a few powerful provincial leaders, rather than a unified central government. Corruption remained endemic, siphoning off vast sums of money from modernization projects. More importantly, the movement was hobbled by the deep-seated conservatism of the Manchu elite. For every reformer like Prince Gong, there were a dozen powerful officials who viewed any adoption of Western ways as a betrayal of their cultural heritage. They saw railways as disturbing the harmony of the land, and telegraph lines as disrupting the natural flow of qi. Cixi herself embodied this central paradox. She was a pragmatist who supported the reforms because she saw them as essential tools for the dynasty's survival. She approved the new arsenals, the shipyards, and the foreign missions because they made the throne stronger. But she was not a revolutionary. She was, at her core, a deeply traditional woman of the court. She would support any technological or administrative reform that bolstered the Qing state, but she would fiercely resist any political or social reform that threatened the absolute authority of the throne or the fundamental structure of the Confucian order. This inherent conflict, the desire for Western technology without Western ideas, would be the fatal flaw of the entire self-strengthening movement. While Cixi was successfully managing the affairs of a vast empire, her greatest challenge, and ultimately her greatest sorrow, lay within the walls of the Forbidden City. It was the very source of her power, her own son, the Tongji Emperor. Her relationship with him was profoundly complex and tragic. On one hand, she was a doting mother who had fought for his birthright. On the other, she was an iron-willed authoritarian regent who demanded absolute obedience. She was determined to mold him into the ideal Confucian sage king, subjecting him to a grueling and relentless schedule of classical studies under the tutelage of the most accomplished scholars in the empire. But the young emperor had neither the aptitude nor the interest for such pursuits. He was a lonely, frustrated, and deeply resentful boy, chafing under his mother's suffocating control. As he grew into a teenager, he found his escape not in the dusty classics, but in the company of courtiers and eunuchs who catered to his baser instincts. When he finally took the throne in his own right in 1873 at the age of 17, formally ending the regency, he proved to be everything his mother had feared. He showed little interest in governing, often falling asleep during court audiences. His primary passions were the theater and extravagant construction projects, chief among them a wildly expensive and ill-conceived plan to rebuild the destroyed old summer palace as a retirement home for his mother, a project she herself had to halt due to its astronomical cost. His rebellion took a darker turn when, encouraged by his dissolute cousins and eunuchs, he began to sneak out of the Forbidden City at night, disguised as a commoner. He spent his nights in the brothels, wine shops, and opera houses of Beijing's notorious southern quarter. It was an open secret in the court, a source of immense shame and anxiety for Cixi. She had successfully governed an empire, but she could not control her own son. Their relationship was further strained by his marriage. When it came time to select an empress, Cixi favored a girl from the Fucha clan, whom she felt would be pliable. The quiet and respected Qian, however, favored a different candidate, the intelligent and dignified Lady Alut from a distinguished Mongol clan. The Tongji Emperor, in a rare act of defiance against his mother, chose Lady Alute. Cixi was infuriated, viewing his choice as a personal rejection. She developed a deep dislike for the new young empress, and the palace became a tense landscape of competing factions. In late 1874, the emperor fell gravely ill. The official court diagnosis was smallpox. He lingered for weeks, his body covered in sores, before finally dying on January 12, 1875. He was only 19 years old. Cixi was reported to be devastated, collapsing with grief at the loss of her only child. But behind the maternal sorrow lay a cold, terrifying political reality. Her son was dead, and he had left no heir. Her entire claim to power, her very identity as the mother of the emperor, had been extinguished with his last breath. The death of the Tongji emperor without an heir plunged the court into a succession crisis of the highest order. The situation was perilous for Cixi. The young Empress Alout was rumored to be pregnant. If she were to give birth to a son, that infant would be the undisputed new emperor, and Alout, as the Empress Dowager, would become the new regent. Cixi would be relegated to the status of a grandmother, respected but politically powerless. After 13 years at the pinnacle of power, she was on the verge of being cast into obscurity. She did not hesitate. On the very night of her son's death, she convened a late-night emergency meeting of the Grand Council. With breathtaking audacity, she did not just break the sacred rules of succession. She reached into the dynastic law book, ripped out the relevant page, and rewrote it in a single night. She was going to break one of the most sacred and inviolable rules of dynastic succession. The rule was clear. A new emperor had to be from the generation below the deceased emperor so that he could perform the proper ancestral rites for his predecessor. But all of Tongji's potential heirs from the next generation were infants. Cixi had another candidate in mind. She declared that the new emperor would be her own nephew, Zaitian, the 3-year-old son of her younger sister, and Prince Chun. The problem was that Zaitian was Tongji's first cousin, a member of the same generation. This was a shocking breach of protocol. Cixi, however, had a brilliant, if legally questionable, solution. She announced that she was posthumously adopting Zaitian as her own son. This clever legal fiction meant that Zaitian was no longer succeeding his cousin Tongji. He was succeeding his adoptive father, the Xianfeng emperor. This elegantly solved two problems at once. It placed her preferred candidate on the throne, and more importantly, it meant that she and Xian, as the widows of the Xianfeng emperor and the mothers of the new child emperor, were once again the legitimate and rightful co-regents. The court was stunned into submission. Before dawn, Prince Chun was roused from his bed and informed that his son had been chosen as the new emperor. He reportedly fainted from the shock, understanding that this meant he would never see his son again, and that the boy's life now belonged to the throne. The child was taken from his home and brought to the Forbidden City, where he was proclaimed the Guangxu Emperor. The final tragic postscript to this drama was the fate of Empress Alout. Just 2 months after her husband's death, she also died. While official histories attribute her passing to a severe illness brought on by grief, unconfirmed rumors of suicide, possibly due to immense pressure from within the court, circulated widely at the time. Whether Cixi was directly responsible remains one of the dark, unprovable stains on her reputation. What is certain is that Alout's convenient death removed the last potential rival to Cixi's power. Once again, Cixi had faced a mortal threat to her political survival and had emerged completely victorious. Through sheer force of will and ruthless political maneuvering, she had secured her position as the ultimate authority in China for another generation. She was once again regent, ruling from behind the curtain. But this time, she was raising a new emperor, a boy who was not her own flesh and blood, but a nephew whom she would shape and control. This new relationship, born of a political coup, would evolve into one of the most complex and ultimately tragic dramas of her long and turbulent life. With her power now more secure than ever, her greatest test would come not from rebellious generals or foreign armies, but from the quiet, resentful boy she was raising to be emperor. With the audacious installation of her 3-year-old nephew as the Guangxu emperor, Cixi had masterfully secured her political future. The co-regency with the senior Empress Dowager Qian was formally reinstated, and the business of ruling the vast Qing Empire resumed. For the next 6 years, the unique partnership that had governed China since the Xinyu coup continued its work. The outside world saw a stable, harmonious arrangement. Xian, the gentle and virtuous Eastern Empress, continued to provide the moral legitimacy and handle the intricate affairs of the imperial household. Cixi, the shrewd and industrious Western Empress, remained the undisputed political mastermind, the driving force behind the throne. They were a study in contrasts, a political machine of surprising efficiency. Then, without warning, the partnership came to a sudden and shocking end. On the evening of April 8, 1881, Empress Dowager Qian died suddenly, with the official cause recorded as a massive stroke. Despite this, the timing immediately sparked rumors that she had been poisoned by Cixi, an accusation that has shadowed Cixi's name for over a century. This claim remains unsupported by contemporary evidence, though it was often bolstered by a dramatic story about Qian possessing a secret edict from the late emperor authorizing Cixi's execution. However, despite the enduring power of these rumors, there is no concrete historical evidence to support the theory of assassination. Most modern historians view it with skepticism. Qian's health was likely more delicate than it appeared, and the court physician's detailed records are consistent with a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. Furthermore, Cixi had little immediate motive for such a drastic and risky act. Their partnership was stable, effective, and had successfully navigated decades of crisis. Xian posed no political threat to Cixi and, in fact, served as a crucial shield, lending a soft, legitimate face to Cixi's hard-edged rule. But whether by stroke or by poison, the result was the same. Cixi was now alone at the absolute summit of power. There was no longer a co-regent, no one of equal standing to question or moderate her. She was the sole, undisputed regent for the boy emperor. Her authority, already immense, was now total. The era of the dual regency was over. The era of Cixi's absolute matriarchy had begun. As Cixi's political power became absolute, her control over the young Guangxu emperor intensified, evolving into one of the most complex and psychologically fraught relationships in modern Chinese history. Snatched from his family home as a toddler, the emperor grew up in a world of suffocating luxury and profound emotional isolation. He was a timid, intelligent, and deeply sensitive child, haunted by the echoing emptiness of the Forbidden City's vast courtyards, and terrified of the formidable woman who was his guardian. Cixi took on the role of his parent with the same meticulous and domineering energy she applied to affairs of state. She oversaw every minute detail of his life. She dictated his rigorous schedule of Confucian studies, chose his tutors, approved his meals, and selected his clothing. Her affection for him appears to have been genuine, but it was a possessive, suffocating affection, inextricably intertwined with her unyielding need for control. She would shower him with gifts and terms of endearment one moment, then subject him to terrifying verbal tirades for the slightest infraction the next. The boy emperor came to address her with a unique and telling term, Chin Baba, which translates to Dear Papa. This unusual nickname perfectly captures the profound and twisted nature of their bond. She was not just a mother figure. She was the supreme patriarchal authority in his life, the source of all power, discipline, and fear. He was utterly dependent on her, yet he lived in constant dread of her displeasure. This upbringing had a devastating psychological impact. Guangxu grew into a young man who was well-read and intelligent, but also plagued by chronic anxiety, indecisiveness, and a debilitating stutter when he was nervous. He was prone to fits of rage in private, followed by long bouts of depression. He was a prisoner in his own palace, trained from infancy to be a symbol, never a master. Cixi had successfully educated a puppet, but in doing so, she had crippled the emotional development of the man she expected to one day lead the empire. It was a relationship of deep, damaged affection that would curdle into bitter resentment, setting the stage for a future tragedy. While the personal drama unfolded within the palace walls, the world outside was growing more dangerous. The relative peace of the Tongji Restoration was giving way to a new, more aggressive phase of foreign imperialism. The Western powers and a newly modernized Japan were no longer content with trade. They began carving out spheres of influence, picking away at the Qing Dynasty's tributary states, the buffer zones that had protected China's borders for centuries. The first major challenge of Cixi's sole regency came from the south. France, having already colonized parts of Southeast Asia, sought to extend its control over Vietnam, a kingdom that had long paid tribute to the Dragon Throne. This encroachment on China's traditional sphere of influence led to a series of clashes that erupted into the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. The Qing court was divided between a war party of hardline conservatives who urged a strong defense of their tributary and a more cautious faction, led by the veteran statesman Prince Gong, who feared the consequences of another full-scale war with a European power. The war itself was a disaster for China. In one of the most humiliating episodes of the conflict, a French naval squadron sailed up the Min River to Fuzhou, home to China's most modern shipyard and the heart of its new southern fleet. On August 23, 1884, the French ships opened fire. In less than an hour, the Chinese fleet, the pride of the self-strengthening movement, was utterly destroyed, with 9 of its 11 steamships sent to the bottom of the river. Although Chinese armies fighting on land in Vietnam and on the Chinese border won some notable victories, the shocking destruction of the Fuzhou fleet broke the nerve of the leadership in Beijing. Cixi, who had initially supported the war party, grew tired of the conflict and sought a quick peace. The resulting treaty was another humiliation, forcing China to formally renounce its centuries-old suzerainty over Vietnam and recognize French dominion over the region. The political fallout was immediate and decisive. Cixi needed a scapegoat for the defeat, and she chose the most powerful man in the government, Prince Gong. Accusing him and the entire Grand Council of indecisiveness and mismanagement, she issued an edict dismissing him from all his official posts. It was a stunning political maneuver. With one stroke of the vermilion brush, Cixi removed the last and most influential member of the original triumvirate that had brought her to power. For over 20 years, Prince Gong had been the indispensable administrator and diplomat of the empire. His dismissal marked a turning point in Cixi's rule. She now cast aside the experienced statesman who might challenge her and instead surrounded herself with more pliant and conservative Manchu officials. Chief among them, the Guangxu Emperor's biological father, the weak-willed Prince Chun. Her rule became even more personal, more absolute, and more dangerously isolated from reality. In the years following the war, as Cixi's power reached its zenith, she embarked on the project most famously and damningly associated with her name, the construction of a magnificent new retirement palace. The old summer palace, The Yuanming Yuan remained a charred ruin. Cixi ordered the renovation and vast expansion of a nearby imperial garden, transforming it into the Yiheyuan, the Garden of Nurtured Harmony. It was a masterpiece of traditional Chinese landscape design, a sprawling paradise of lakes, gardens, temples, and pavilions. The project's most infamous feature was a beautiful two-storied structure built on the shore of the lake in the shape of a paddle steamer made entirely of marble and stone. This marble boat would become the ultimate symbol of Cixi's alleged corruption and folly. The popular story, repeated for over a century, is that Cixi directly embezzled funds explicitly designated for the creation of a modern navy and squandered them on her extravagant garden, effectively trading warships for a pleasure palace while her nation lay defenseless. The truth is more complex, though no less damning. The funding was indeed reappropriated from the naval budget, but through a clever and deliberately opaque scheme where funds for the summer palace renovation were redirected under the supervision of the Board of Admiralty, which Prince Chun nominally headed, though the degree of his personal involvement in the scheme remains unclear. The rationale was to provide a graceful way for Cixi to retire once the Guangxu Emperor came of age. The Yiheyuan would allow her to step down from the regency while remaining physically close to the Forbidden City, where she could continue to supervise and influence her nephew. However, the optics were catastrophic. In an era when China was desperately trying to build a modern navy to fend off foreign predators, the spectacle of the court spending vast fortunes on a lavish garden was seen as a profound betrayal of the national interest. The motionless marble boat became the perfect, tragic metaphor for a dynasty that was investing in opulent illusions while its ship of state was sinking. In 1889, the Guangxu Emperor, now 17, was married. Cixi had personally chosen his bride, her own niece Jingfen, a plain and awkward young woman who would be known as the Empress Longyu. The marriage was a purely political move designed to plant Cixi's loyal agent in the emperor's bedchamber and ensure her family's continued influence. Guangxu despised his empress and instead became deeply infatuated with one of his new consorts. The lively, intelligent, and progressive-minded consort Zhen, better known as the Pearl Concubine. Zhen encouraged the emperor's interest in reform in the outside world, earning her Cixi's lasting enmity. With the emperor now married, Cixi formally announced her retirement. In a grand ceremony, she handed the reins of government over to her nephew and retreated to her splendid new summer palace. The era of the regency was officially over. But no one, least of all the Guangxu emperor, believed that she had truly relinquished power. From her lakeside paradise, the Empress Dowager continued to watch, listen, and pull the strings. The young emperor, now nominally in charge, was eager to prove himself. But he had inherited a government paralyzed by conservatism and was about to face a challenge from a new and dangerous rival. Across the sea, Meiji Japan had embarked on a path of radical state-driven modernization that was far more thorough and effective than China's slow, half-hearted self-strengthening movement. Japan now had a modern Western-style army and navy, and it had its own imperial ambitions. The inevitable clash came over Korea, the most important of China's tributary states and a crucial strategic buffer. When a rebellion broke out in Korea in 1894, both China and Japan sent troops ostensibly to restore order. Tensions quickly escalated into the First Sino-Japanese War. The Qing court, steeped in centuries of cultural superiority, was utterly contemptuous of Japan, which it dismissed as a nation of dwarf pirates, playing dress-up in Western uniforms. They expected a quick and easy victory, What they got was the single most humiliating military defeat in the dynasty's history. The war was an unmitigated catastrophe. On the seas, China's new Beiyang fleet, the pride of Li Hongzhang's modernization efforts, was ambushed and obliterated by the more modern and better-led Japanese Navy at the Battle of the Yalu River. On land, the corrupt and poorly organized Qing armies were repeatedly routed by Japan's disciplined forces in Korea and Manchuria. The shock of this defeat was profound. To be humbled by the industrial might of Britain or France was one thing. To be so thoroughly and shamefully thrashed by a small Asian neighbor that had always lived in China's cultural shadow was a psychological cataclysm. It shattered the nation's pride and exposed the utter bankruptcy of the 30-year-long self-strengthening movement. All the new arsenals, warships, and modern weapons had been for nothing. The giant had been felled by the dwarf. The war ended with the crushing Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. China was forced to recognize the full independence of Korea, hand over the island of Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and the strategic Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, and pay a crippling war indemnity that was the equivalent of several years of the entire government's revenue. While an intervention by Russia, Germany, and France later forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula, the damage was done. The Qing Dynasty stood naked and exposed before the world, its weakness laid bare for all to see. For the young Guangxu Emperor, the defeat was a radicalizing moment. He now knew with absolute certainty that the slow conservative path of reform favored by his dear Papa had been a catastrophic failure. He came to believe that only drastic, rapid, and fundamental change, a complete overhaul of the entire system, could save China from being torn apart by foreign powers. In the ashes of the war, a new generation of radical reformers found their voice, and they now had a sympathetic ear on the dragon throne. The stage was set for a final tragic confrontation, pitting the prisoner emperor against the aging but still formidable matriarch who had controlled his entire life. This was no longer a personal dispute between a mother and her son. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, a clash between two irreconcilable futures. The crushing defeat in the Sino-Japanese War was more than just a military humiliation. It was a profound intellectual and spiritual shock. It proved beyond any doubt that the self-strengthening movement, the slow, conservative project of grafting Western technology onto an unchanged Confucian core, had been a catastrophic failure. The dynasty's pride was shattered, and its weakness was laid bare for the world to see. In the aftermath, the foreign powers, sensing the Qing was on its deathbed, descended like vultures. This period became known as the scramble for concessions, or more vividly in Chinese, the carving of the melon. The metaphor was brutally accurate. China was seen as a helpless entity to be sliced up and devoured by the imperialist powers. In 1897, using the murder of 2 German missionaries as a pretext, Germany seized Jiaozhou Bay and the port of Qingdao. Russia, seeing its rivals move, promptly forced a lease of the strategic Port Arthur at the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, the very territory it had forced Japan to return to China just years earlier. To maintain the balance of power, Great Britain demanded a lease on the port of Weihaiwei and a massive 99-year lease on the new territories, expanding its colony of Hong Kong. France secured a lease on Guangzhouwan in the south. Each of these concessions was a dagger in the heart of Chinese sovereignty, creating foreign-controlled naval bases, railway zones, and mining rights deep within Chinese territory. It seemed to many that the complete colonization and dismemberment of the nation was imminent. This atmosphere of existential crisis created fertile ground for a new, more radical strain of thinking. The old guard of reformers had been discredited. A new generation of intellectuals argued that China's problems were not merely technological, but fundamentally political and institutional. To save itself, China needed to do what Japan had done, throw off the shackles of the old system and completely remake itself as a modern nation-state. And in the Forbidden City, they found a desperate and willing listener on the dragon throne. The young Guangxu emperor, now in his late 20s, had been shaken from his political apathy by the humiliation of the Japanese War. He was consumed by a sense of urgency and shame, and he now believed that radical change was the only path to national salvation. He began to avidly read translations of Western works on history and politics, and he found his champion in a charismatic and controversial scholar from the South named Kang Yuwei. Kang was a brilliant messianic figure, a visionary who possessed both a profound knowledge of the Confucian classics and a radical imagination. To get around the immense conservative opposition to change, Kang developed a daring and to many heretical reinterpretation of Confucianism itself. He argued that the ancient texts had been distorted over centuries, and that Confucius was not a stodgy traditionalist, but a visionary social and political reformer. By framing radical change as a return to the true spirit of Confucianism, he provided the emperor with the ideological cover he needed to act. Supported by his equally brilliant student, the writer Liang Qichao, and a small circle of passionate, idealistic young officials, including the fiery Tan Sitong, who was willing to die for the cause, Kang Yuwei gained the emperor's ear. In the early summer of 1898, despite the fierce opposition of the conservative Manchu establishment, the Guangxu emperor, feeling the weight of a crumbling nation on his shoulders, decided to throw his full authority behind Kang's vision. He was finally ready to challenge his dear papa and seize control of his own destiny and the destiny of China. On June 11, 1898, the emperor issued his first reform decree. It was the beginning of a breathtaking political whirlwind that would last for 103 days, a period known to history as the 100 Days Reform. From his desk in the Forbidden City, Guangxu unleashed a torrent of edicts aimed at modernizing virtually every aspect of Chinese government and society, with the ultimate goal of transforming the Qing Empire from an ancient absolute monarchy into a modern constitutional one. The proposed changes were sweeping and revolutionary. In education, he ordered the abolition of the eight-legged essay, the rigid, esoteric literary form that had been the basis of the civil service examinations for centuries, and demanded a new focus on practical modern subjects. He decreed the founding of a new imperial university in Beijing and the conversion of old temples and monasteries across the country into modern schools. In government, he called for the streamlining of the hopelessly bloated and inefficient bureaucracy, abolishing a host of sinecure positions and redundant agencies, thereby creating a host of powerful new enemies overnight. In the economy, he called for the establishment of a national budget, the promotion of railways, industry, and commerce, and the creation of a modern banking system. He ordered the military to be reorganized and retrained along Western lines. For a brief, heady summer, it seemed as if the ancient empire was finally awakening. Beijing was electric with a sense of revolutionary possibility. But the reformers, in their idealism and haste, had made a fatal error. They were brilliant intellectuals, but they were politically naive. They had the emperor's blessing, but they had no real power base. They had no control over the military and had grievously underestimated the deep and bitter resistance of the conservative establishment, whose privileges and entire worldview they were threatening. And from her nearby summer palace, The Empress Dowager Cixi was watching. To Cixi, who had spent decades carefully balancing competing factions and pursuing a path of slow, cautious reform, her nephew's radical program was an act of reckless insanity. This was not a mere policy disagreement. It was a fundamental betrayal. The boy she had placed on the throne, the son she had raised and educated, was systematically dismantling the entire Confucian system she had fought her whole life to preserve. He was attacking the scholarly elite, alienating the Manchu aristocracy, and threatening the very foundations of the dynasty. Initially, she did not intervene directly, perhaps hoping the emperor would exhaust himself, but her powerful conservative allies, led by the Manchu general Ronglu, flocked to her, begging her to step in and put a stop to the madness. The breaking point came in September. The reformers, realizing that their window of opportunity was closing and that Cixi was preparing to act against them, made a desperate and clumsy gamble. They hatched a plot to neutralize the Empress Dowager. Their plan was to win over Yuan Shikai, a shrewd and ambitious general who commanded the most modern and powerful army corps in northern China. They would ask Yuan to march his troops to Beijing, surround the Summer Palace, and place Cixi under permanent house arrest. The most radical among them, Tan Sitong, even suggested that if necessary she should be killed. It was a suicidal miscalculation. Yuan Shikai was a master opportunist, not an idealist. He listened to the reformers' plot, assessed their weakness, and immediately understood where the true power lay. On the evening of September 20th, he took a train to Tianjin, went straight to the headquarters of General Ronglu, Cixi's most trusted confidant, and revealed every detail of the plot. Ronglu immediately alerted the Empress Dowager. Cixi's response was swift, decisive, and utterly ruthless. She had faced down a council of regents 37 years earlier. She would not be toppled by a handful of upstart scholars. On the night of September 21st, 1898, she rode a special train into Beijing, her procession entering the Forbidden City through a gate reserved only for the ruler. She immediately confronted the terrified Guangxu emperor, who fell to his knees, begging for his life. She seized the imperial seals and, using his name, issued an edict proclaiming that the emperor was suffering from a grave illness and had requested that she, the Empress Dowager, resume the regency to guide the nation. It was her second successful coup. The 100 Days reform was over. The emperor was taken to Yingtai, the ocean terrace, a small isolated palace on an island in the middle of a lake within the Forbidden City grounds. He would live there for the rest of his life, a prisoner in his own home, his only companions, the eunuchs who served as his jailers. A wave of arrests followed. Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, warned just in time, managed to escape to Japan with the help of foreign sympathizers. But 6 other leading reformers, including the brave Tan Sitong, who refused to flee, were captured. They became known as the 6 Gentlemen. Denied a trial, they were paraded through the streets of Beijing and summarily beheaded. Cixi was back in total, absolute command. Her victory, however, placed her in a perilous position. She had crushed the reform movement, but she had also alienated the foreign powers, who had viewed the Guangxu emperor's program with sympathy and now saw Cixi as a hopeless reactionary. They made it clear they would not accept any attempt to depose or harm the emperor. Feeling cornered and deeply suspicious of foreign intentions, Cixi and the hardline conservatives who now dominated her court made a desperate and catastrophic gamble. They decided to embrace a force of violent, mystical, and ferociously anti-foreign peasants who were sweeping across northern China, the Boxers. The Yiheituan, or righteous and harmonious fists, were members of a secret society rooted in the impoverished and flood-prone province of Shandong. They practiced traditional martial arts and esoteric rituals, believing that these could make them invulnerable to foreign bullets. They channeled popular anger, blaming all of China's woes, from drought and famine to the erosion of sovereignty, on the foreign devils and their Chinese Christian converts, who they believed had angered the gods and disturbed the harmony of the land. Their rallying cry was simple and potent: support the Qing, destroy the foreigner. At first, the Qing court treated the Boxers as dangerous rebels, but as the movement grew, Cixi and her advisors began to see them differently. They were not a threat, but a weapon. Here was a massive, popular, and seemingly invincible army of loyal patriots that could be unleashed to finally drive the hated foreigners out of China once and for all. It was an idea born of profound desperation, magical thinking, and a deep-seated xenophobic rage. Encouraged by fanatical Manchu princes at court, who presented her with forged documents proving the foreigners were demanding her abdication, Cixi made her fateful decision. She threw the full support of the dynasty behind the Boxers. In June 1900, thousands of Boxers, clad in red turbans and sashes, surged into Beijing. They hunted down and murdered Chinese Christians and besieged the city's cathedrals. Soon, joined by regular Imperial Army troops, they laid siege to the Foreign Legation Quarter, a walled compound where the entire diplomatic community, along with foreign civilians and soldiers, had taken refuge. Swept up in the hysteria, Cixi took the final insane step. On June 21st, she issued a formal imperial edict of war, declaring war not on one nation, but on 11 foreign powers simultaneously. It was an act of imperial madness, a declaration of war against the entire industrialized world. An 8-nation alliance composed of troops from Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary was quickly assembled to crush the uprising and relieve the besieged legations. They landed at Tianjin and fought their way inland against fierce resistance. By mid-August, they were at the gates of Beijing. The dynasty's gamble had failed in the most spectacular way possible. As the Allied armies breached the city walls, Cixi knew all was lost. In the pre-dawn hours of August 15th, disguised in the rough blue cloth of a peasant woman and her famous long fingernails cut short, the 64-year-old Empress Dowager, along with the Guangxu Emperor and a small terrified retinue, fled the forbidden city in a common cart. It was the second time in her life she had been forced to abandon her capital. Her grueling, humiliating journey would take her to the ancient city of Xi'an. Behind her, the capital was once again occupied, its palaces looted, and its people subjected to the brutal revenge of foreign armies. The Boxer Rebellion had ended in the ultimate humiliation, leaving the Qing Dynasty shamed, broken, and completely at the mercy of the world powers. From the ashes of this self-inflicted catastrophe, the aging Empress Dowager would have to confront her ultimate failure and attempt one last desperate transformation to save the throne. The flight to Xi'an was the nadir of Cixi's long and dramatic life. Disguised, disgraced, and on the run, she was the ruler of a dynasty that had become an international pariah. In Beijing, the Forbidden City was occupied. The victorious armies of the 8-nation alliance were exacting a brutal revenge on the population, looting treasures and executing anyone suspected of being a Boxer. While the court languished in provincial exile for over a year, the grim task of negotiating a settlement fell to the aged and ailing Li Hongzhang. It was to be his final and most humiliating act of service to the dynasty. he had no cards to play. The Qing had unconditionally surrendered. The result was the Boxer Protocol of 1901, the last and most crushingly punitive of all the unequal treaties. The terms were designed not just to compensate, but to permanently cripple and shame the dynasty. The punishments were severe. 10 high-ranking officials who had supported the Boxers were ordered to be executed or forced to commit suicide. The Taku forts, which guarded the approach to the capital, were to be demolished. An imperial edict was to be issued banning all anti-foreign societies forever, and the civil service examinations were to be suspended for 5 years in cities where foreigners had been attacked. To atone for the murder of the German minister, the emperor's own uncle was to lead a formal apology mission to Berlin. The concessions were just as galling. The legation quarter in Beijing was to be expanded and turned into a fortress, garrisoned exclusively by foreign troops, an independent citadel outside of Chinese law. Foreign armies would also be permanently stationed at key points between Beijing and the sea. But the most devastating blow was the indemnity. China was ordered to pay a staggering sum of 450 million taels of silver, more than the government's total annual tax revenue, to the 8 Allied powers. To be paid over a period of 39 years, the interest payments would nearly double the total amount. It was a debt of such colossal magnitude that it would drain the imperial treasury for the rest of its existence, mortgaging the nation's future and strangling its ability to fund any meaningful reforms. It was the ultimate humiliation, the final nail in the coffin of the Qing sovereignty and prestige. In January 1902, after more than a year in exile, the imperial court finally returned to Beijing. Cixi's journey back was not the hurried, terrified scramble of her flight. It was a carefully staged piece of political theater. She traveled by a special train, a symbol of the modernity she had once resisted, and made a point of stopping to greet the foreign railway engineers. The woman who returned to the Forbidden City was, by all accounts, a changed woman. The profound shock and disgrace of the Boxer catastrophe appeared to have broken her conservative resolve and awakened in her a grim new understanding of reality. The defiant, xenophobic matriarch was gone. In her place was a surprisingly pragmatic and even charming diplomat. She launched an unprecedented public relations campaign to repair her shattered image and convince the Western powers that she was now a friend and a reformer. In a shocking break with millennia of imperial protocol that kept the ruler distant and divine, she began to engage in a form of personal diplomacy. She hosted elaborate teas in the summer palace for the wives of foreign diplomats, showering them with gifts and presenting a warm, grandmotherly persona. She allowed the American artist Catherine Carl to paint her portrait for the St. Louis World's Fair. She even became fascinated with the new technology of photography, posing for a series of carefully crafted portraits, sometimes dressed as Guanyin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy, a stark contrast to the West's dragon lady caricature. It was a calculated and remarkably successful charm offensive, but beneath the smiles and pleasantries lay a desperate last-ditch effort to save her dynasty from the forces of revolution that were now gathering both at home and abroad. In the most stunning reversal of her entire political career, Cixi, the arch-conservative who had ruthlessly crushed the Guangxu emperor's reforms just 3 years earlier, now embraced the very cause of modernization. From 1901 until her death, the Qing court, under her absolute authority, launched a program of institutional change known as the New Policies. In its scope, it was even more radical than the 100 Days reform she had destroyed. The reforms were sweeping. In education, she made the single most revolutionary decision of her reign. In 1905, she issued an edict abolishing the Confucian civil service examination system. This was not just a reform, it was the end of a world. For over 1,300 years, the examination system had been the bedrock of the Chinese state and civilization, the central pillar of the scholar official class. By abolishing it, Cixi severed the dynasty's link to the Confucian tradition that had sustained it for centuries, hoping to build a new one based on modern, Western-style schools and universities. In the military, she approved the creation of a modern, European-trained new army. This policy, however, would have a fatal, unforeseen consequence. The new military academies and officer corps became breeding grounds for revolutionary ideas, and the powerful new armies, particularly the Beiyang army under the command of Yuan Shikai, would develop loyalties to their commanders rather than to the throne. The dynasty was, in effect, forging the very weapon that would one day be used to overthrow it. Most surprisingly, she even embraced political reform. She dispatched missions to Japan and the West to study their political systems. Upon their return, she announced that China would, in due course, become a constitutional monarchy. In 1908, a Principles of the Constitution was promulgated, promising a national parliament and a written constitution within a 9-year transitional period. Provincial assemblies were established as a first step. Social reforms were also enacted, including a nationwide ban on the ancient practice of foot binding and the lifting of the prohibition on marriage between Manchus and Han Chinese. Was this a genuine change of heart, or was it a cynical attempt to outmaneuver the growing revolutionary movement led by exiles like Sun Yat-sen? The truth, as with Cixi, is that it was likely both. She had finally realized with the clarity of near-death experience that only fundamental change could save the dynasty, but it was far too little and far too late. For decades, the court had resisted change. Now, by embracing it, they unleashed new ideas and new social forces that they could no longer control. The reforms did not strengthen the dynasty. They merely hastened its demise by raising expectations that the decaying Manchu court could never hope to meet. Cixi's final years were a frantic race against time. She was now an old woman, her health steadily failing, but one last dark drama was yet to play out within the walls of the Forbidden City. The Guangxu Emperor was still a prisoner on his island, his own health rapidly deteriorating from what was likely chronic nephritis, exacerbated by years of stress and depression. He remained the symbol of reform for many, and he nursed a deep and patient hatred for the one who had ruined his life. He dreamed of the day she would die, when he would resume power, undo her conservative policies, and he vowed to his consorts have her favorite general, Yuan Shikai, beheaded for his betrayal in 1898. Cixi knew this. She knew that her own death would be the signal for the emperor's return to power. His restoration would mean a complete reversal of her legacy, the purge of all her allies, and the ruin of her family's standing. She was utterly determined that he would not outlive her. In early November 1908, both the Empress Dowager and the Emperor fell critically ill. On her deathbed, Cixi made her final move. On November 14th, the 37-year-old Guangxu Emperor died in his island prison from a sudden, agonizing illness. With her enemy gone and her legacy secured by naming her 2-year-old grandnephew, Puyi, as the heir, the Empress Dowager Cixi herself died the very next day, on November 15th, 1908. She was 72 years old. The timing was so extraordinary that for a century, rumors of foul play persisted. Was it possible the emperor had been murdered? The mystery was finally solved in 2008, when, using modern forensic techniques, Chinese researchers tested strands of the emperor's hair which had been preserved in his tomb. They discovered levels of arsenic that were more than 2,000 times higher than that of a healthy person. The conclusion was inescapable. The Guangxu emperor had been poisoned with a massive acute dose of the toxin. While no written order has ever been found, the historical consensus is clear. Cixi, on her deathbed, was the only person with the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit the crime. It was her final, ruthless act of statecraft, a last strike from behind the silk screen to ensure that her bitter enemy and his reformist agenda would be buried with her. Later accounts, likely originating from Republican-era propaganda rather than her actual last words, claimed she whispered, "Never again allow a woman to hold the supreme power of the state." So who was she? Was she the reactionary monster of popular legend, the ignorant and arrogant tyrant who doomed China to a century of humiliation? Or was she a tragic figure, a brilliant political survivor who held a crumbling empire together against impossible odds? The truth is that she was both, and something more complex than either. The case against her is formidable. She was a creature of the old world, a deeply conservative ruler in an age that demanded radical change. Her ruthless 1898 coup stunted China's political development, and her catastrophic decision to back the Boxer Rebellion was a national disaster born of paranoia and ignorance. Yet for nearly half a century, she governed a nation of 400 million people through periods of internal rebellion and relentless foreign aggression. She did so with sheer political skill and an indomitable will to survive, winning out against Manchu regents, foreign armies, and idealistic reformers. She oversaw the Tongji Restoration, which gave the dynasty a crucial 30 years of life. And in the end, it was she who finally belatedly launched the radical modernizations, abolishing the exam system, creating a new army, and paving the way for a constitution that would ironically create the conditions for the revolution that swept her dynasty from power just 3 years after her death. Cixi's story is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a profoundly human story about power, survival, and the tragedy of a leader whose vision could not ultimately keep pace with a rapidly changing world. She was not the one-dimensional dragon lady of legend, but something far more complex and far more fascinating. A brilliant, flawed, and formidable woman who ruled a dying empire from behind a silk screen right up to the very end.